And now we're going to build on to what Robbie and or Joanne and Robbie unleashed this morning, this idea of the principle behind the American system and national banking. And Craig will be doing a credit system for Australia. Lessons for today on how Ted Theodore and his fiduciary note issue proposal of 1932 have eliminated the effects of the Great Depression and transformed Australia forever. So let's hand over to Craig.
Just before I start, and we're getting set up here, those books are on the table there so you can see. If you want to follow through on any of the material that I present today, the books are relatively freely available on the internet. They're not necessarily cheap, but all of those books have some aspect of the story I'm about to tell this afternoon, so take a note of them if you'd like. Also, I'd like to thank Bob Butler over here. Bob, do you want to stand up? Have you got your coat on you can model as well? Yeah, so he's got a CEC coat on. Pity we sold them all. Bob's done an enormous amount of research and background stuff for both Robbie and I, and for other presentations on the whole question of credit creation in this country. And like I said earlier, we're not doing anything on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. Because that in itself is a huge story, but proof of this idea that credit is the way that you build a country. Hang on, I'm falling apart here. I might move it. I'm falling off again. I dare not fall off. That would be really impairing my reputation, wouldn't it? Take it away, Ben.
In October 1929, the newsreel camera captured the first federal Labor government for 15 years. The smiling Prime Minister was James Scullin, but the architect of victory was the Treasurer, Ted Theodore. Within days of these pictures being taken, Scullin and Theodore would confront the worst economic crisis of this century. It would destroy Ted Theodore's political career, but it would shape economic policy for decades to come.
Unemployment in Australia in 1927 through to 1938 meant enormous suffering for the Australian people. And consequently, as you'll see from the end of this presentation, it's totally and absolutely unnecessary. It was simply a marker of the sheer bastardry of the British Empire and its associated monetarist policy. The misery of the Great Depression was totally avoidable. The enthusiasm for change was palpable when Scullin came into government at that particular time. People were enthusiastic for real change. There was some real talent in the cabinet, or in the government at that point, including two of these who became our wartime prime ministers. and treasurer. But really, at the particular time, the guy in the middle summed up the situation. His name was Frank Anstey. He was actually an authentic political genius, a guy that absolutely knew his way around the political field. He knew what was going on. He absolutely hated London's financial community. He was a member of O'Malley's torpedo brigade that got us the Commonwealth Bank. And he was very quick to realise that the government's fate was written in sand because it was in office and not in power. Anstey and Curtin believed that the Conservative majority in the Senate at that time, which was owned and run by the London bankers, would never allow the Scullin government to do what was necessary to wrest financial power from the money power by nationalising the banks. Anstey, with the support of John Curtin, urged Scullin to dissolve both houses of Parliament and go back to the people with the expectation that there would be a landslide victory, that they would achieve a majority in both houses. But unfortunately, they found little support amongst their colleagues, who unfortunately had also faced two elections since 1928, because Stanley Bruce had held an election in the 17th of November 1928, and only 11 months later you had this election which brought them to power. So consequently, the fate of everything that was done from this period onward was written with that dynamic in mind. Anstey, Curtin, even Jack Lang, all knew the forces that were arrayed against them. This was the only opportunity, actually, that I've seen, that the entire money power, the force of the money power could have been taken away from the City of London, but it wasn't. What is this money power? Well, I'd like to invite Frank Anstey to give us a sense of it.
The grip of British capitalism upon Australia consists not only of mortgages upon Australian governments, not only of the overseas ownership of Australian resources, but upon the control of nearly 1/3 of the total depository power of the Australian people per medium of the British banks and British insurances trading within Australia. The English banks control the English life, fire and marine insurances trading in Australia. They control English-owned territories in all states. They control a large portion of our coal, meat and wool resources. They are the dominant factor in the export and import business of this continent. Around the English banks are gathered the old imperial land grant companies and others of kindred type. These imperial land grant and associated land and mineral companies cover millions of acres, represent scores of millions in value, and from their coal, meat and wool resources pour out millions of revenue per year for their overseas owners. Linked up with these are the estates of the free Old English gentry who squatted upon Australian soil during the early part of last century. The descendants of those families are a peculiar caste. Their spiritual home is England. Their outlook, their education, their adopted mannerisms, their social and business relations are all English. Like the Anglo-Indian, Australia is to them another India, an accidental birthplace, a place of occasional temporary residence from whence their money flows. Thus, all the financial and industrial relations of these men are with English banks and English companies. Thus, they are constantly changing from Australia to England and vice versa, and those on the English end of company directorates one year are found on the Australian end the next year, and later on back again. These men seldom enter into the public life of Australia, but the corporations with which they are connected are the heavy subsidisers of local reactionary propaganda. The wool, the meat, the coal resources of Australia, controlled by the English group, are financed by the English banks, handled by English companies, shipped through and by English companies, insured by English companies, and the directorates of the banks and of these companies are interwoven, interlocked, interchanged. Moreover, As more and more of Australian-founded houses fall into the maws of the English group, so the export and import business of Australia approaches more and more to an absolute monopoly headquartered in London. The old trade names are retained to hide the absorption, but whatever remains unabsorbed is subordinate and subsidiary to the paramount power in Australia's overseas trade. Australia is a mere appendage of financial London without distinct economic existence. London is, so far, the web centre of international finance. In London are assembled the actual chiefs or the representatives of the great financial houses of the world. The money power is something more than capitalism. These men constitute the financial oligarchy. No nation can be really free where this financial oligarchy is permitted to hold dominion, and no democracy can be aught but a name that does not shake it from its throne.
So whilst I'm giving this presentation, I want you to keep an eye on this hat. It's not going to disappear or anything, but that is the dynamic that I'm talking through right throughout this presentation, what he just said. Sorry? Ironically, the first 75 pages of Bob Catter's book is on Ted Theodore. So, I mean, and Ted Theodore came from Bob Catter's area. So, I mean, there's a real affection. I only wish he would put his principles into more action instead of rhetoric. But this is a story of a true tragedy, right? Here you had the opportunity that if the Labor Party had adopted Nancy's approach, then the money power could have been broken here in Australia forever. But this time, unfortunately, apart from these few souls, found a little people. Look, the Commonwealth Bank had already been founded, right? We'd already done that work with King O'Malley. We had it there. It could have been allowed to function as a national bank, but it was smashed by the money power in London. So it's against this backdrop, against Anstey's words, that I want you to look at what happened from the start of the Scullin government through to this next period. Our story starts in the 1920s. This is a period where Australia paid its debt literally off the sheep's back and by exporting wheat. Our manufacturing economy was tiny, our financial markets small compared to the US, and our banking system totally controlled by the British banks through the Bank of England. And unlike the US, we had no bank collapses, as our banks were totally run from the City of London.
A strong overseas market for wheat and wool enabled Australia to meet the interest on loans readily available from London and New York. Good seasons, high prices and borrowed money masked the coming crisis.
And we had grown accustomed to steady government borrowing right through the 20s. There was a big period of expansion in that period. Public works for this, setting up infrastructure for cities and for transport and for newer industries and things like that.
Even the nation's brand new capital city was built on borrowed money. As the Duke of York opened Parliament House in 1927, export prices fell, putting a question mark against Australia's capacity to repay loans. The national debt had grown to record levels under the Conservative Prime Minister Stanley Melbourne Bruce.
Bruce was more English than the English. He dressed like an Englishman, striped pants, spats, little white coverings over the shoes, white suede, I suppose, buckled underneath. I don't know what their function was supposed to be.
Pull up your underpants. Ah, they ain't underpants. They're spats.
Labor had been in the federal wilderness since the conscription split of the First World War. In hope of new direction, they turned to the strong man of Queensland politics, Ted Theodore. The son of a hard-working Irish woman and a Romanian sailor, Theodore left school during the Depression of the 1890s to try his luck on the goldfields of Western Australia. 1906, he joined the rush to North Queensland. Riding his bike between mining camps, railway gangs and two-up joints, he organised a union. Within 3 years, he was a member of State Parliament.
There was an election meeting there, and Theodore was addressing the multitude, and a group of fellows who were going to smash up the meeting, and 3 of them got onto the platform where Theodore was speaking. And he was a big, strong fellow, Theodore, and he grabbed the 3 of them, and he hustled the 3 of them off the platform there, single-handed. He was a fellow about, I'd say, nearly 6 feet, but a tough, hard, broad, thick-set, strong-looking character.
When I was about 7 at school, one of my little schoolmates said, my father's a policeman, see, and I'll tell on you, see, my father's a policeman. And I didn't know what my father did, and sometime later, I mentioned it to my father, and he roared with laughter. He said, well, you could have said to her, well, my father is in charge of all policemen, and I'll tell on you, see? And I said, well, how can you do that? And he said, well, I'm Premier of Queensland.
By 1919, the 34-year-old Theodore was Queensland Premier. When he resigned to enter federal politics 6 years later, he was a wealthy man. He played the stock market and carried a silver-topped cane. In 1927, he moved to Sydney and paid £8,000 for a mansion in Kirribilli. The communists, who he tried to drive out of the Labor Party, called him Kirribilli Ted. Conservative journalists dubbed him Red Ted. Across the harbour from Theodore's Kirribilli home lay his federal electorate, centred on the narrow streets and workers' cottages of the Balmain docklands.
And I thought he was the best type of politician I'd met, because he wasn't interested in just cultivating votes for himself. He was a man with a mission, a man with a policy. Development of Australia, development of Australian industry, development of Australia as an independent nation.
Prime Minister Bruce saw Theodore as a threat and set up a royal commission into allegations that Theodore had paid the sitting Labor member £8,000 to resign. Theodore was found not guilty, but it was rumoured that his friend John Wren, the Melbourne SP bookmaker millionaire, had organised the cash. From the opposition front bench, Theodore led the attack on Bruce's economic management. Bruce blamed the workers' high wages and low productivity for Australia's falling export income.
And in 1928, they're putting up the same solution to the economic problems they're putting up today. The donkey must work harder and eat less chaff and carry more sticks, then he's better off.
When 12,000 miners were locked out of Hunter Valley coal mines for refusing a 12.5% pay cut, Bruce's industrial policy split his government.
The Federal Labor Party, of which I have the honour to be deputy leader, is appealing to the people of Australia in what is probably the most momentous election campaign in the history of the Commonwealth. Throughout the length and breadth of Australia, there has for months past been a clamour for a lowering of the costs of production. When large employing interests speak of lowering the cost of production, they mean only one thing: a reduction of wages and a lengthening of hours. To safeguard their wages and conditions, therefore, the workers should return the Labour Party to power.
We're in the money. We're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along. We're in the money, the skies are sunny. Oh man, depression, you are through, you've done us wrong.
In Labor's landslide lower house victory, Bruce lost his seat and retired to England. Hopes were high that the new Labor government would make long-promised reforms. James Scullin from Richmond and Melbourne was Australia's first Catholic Prime Minister.
Scullin was a charmer, honourable, nice, trustworthy, absolute gentleman, scholar. All the things that make for a bad politician.
Ted Theodore was the Treasurer and Chief Policy Maker of the government. Conservatives feared him because of his actions in Queensland. He'd led the fight against conscription, abolished the upper house, and was the first Australian politician to borrow money outside England.
Theodore, from the very beginning, was a marked man. He was the only member of that whole Scullin government who had any sense of economics. He knew all the tricks of the game. He could beat them at their own game.
Theodore said Australia should be more than a sheep farm and was determined to expand local manufacturing.
He used to have his suits made from Australian woven material, Yarra Falls woven material, and they were like cardboard. They'd stand up on their own. His colleagues would rib him about these awful, they'd feel and say, "Oh, Ted, what are you doing wearing that awful material?" And he'd say, "Well, you should all be doing this too. Aren't we trying to promote Australian-made goods?"
So you had the election of the Scullin government sworn in on October the 21st, 1929. 4 days later, the stock market blew out in New York. $26 billion was wiped off on one day as the beginning of a continuous slide for years to come. It became impossible for Australia to borrow money overseas anymore. So Theodore, after being sworn in, rushed off to the Treasury to find out what he'd inherited, and he'd inherited an enormous £13.4 million deficit from the Bruce government. So initially he could only do the classical thing. So he increased tariffs, he increased taxes, he cut expenditure, right? And this caused companies, of course, to begin sacking people because they had to cut their expenditure too to meet their loans, and then began a process of what's called price deflation, that is falling prices. Companies had to cut their prices to try and move into inventories.
Unemployment rose 5% during Labor's first 6 months in office.
We are passing through a period of depression. Large numbers of our people are unemployed. Large percentage are out of work. The Australian government that has just come into power, the Australian Labor government, is faced with many difficulties, many serious problems. And our first problem is to provide work for the workless in Australia.
Repeat, loop. Here we had a depression, which most people had never experienced in life in before. They were bemused, they were lost and quite confused, but it was a depression.
In those days, the depression was more like a natural event, like a flood or an earthquake. No one really understood that it had causes. It had just happened. So what can you do about a flood or an earthquake? Not much.
There doesn't seem to be any quiet, easy period of sunshine for any of the great European and American nations. We're all under the pressure of events. The whole world is under pressure.
They thought the depression should never occur, should never happen. So what you had to do is more of the same. Reduce costs, reduce wages, reduce government expenditure, reduce deficits. In other words, tighten everything up, which of course made it worse.
But Theodore didn't want to wait for a world recovery because he was responsible for the Australian economy. The problem he had was that the government was only getting what's called orthodox advice, basically from from the Commonwealth Bank at that particular time, because monetary policy in the 1930s was actually set by the chairman and the board of the Commonwealth Bank, who was actually led by a Scottish fellow by the name of Sir Robert Gibson. But to try and get around this blockage, I mean, because Sir Robert Gibson was a private banker's banker, so he had a public bank in the sense of the Commonwealth Bank in the hands of private bankers. So of course they're not going to do anything, they're just going to do what the City of London tells them to do. So Theodore introduced a special bill. He introduced the Reserve Bank Bill to establish a separate reserve bank, not the one we got now, and give the government a greater say in the government and the running of money. He said money should not be a servant. Money should be a servant, not a master. And through the Reserve Bank, the government could influence the volume of money in circulation, right? Because at this particular time, the problem with the crashing companies is that all the bank loans were tied to gold, right? At that particular time, 25% of all loans had to be backed by the banks in gold. So what was happening is that the gold was going out because companies were settling their accounts in gold because that's all they could do, and consequently the money supply as a whole was collapsing through the floor. So his idea was to create a bank that could emit money.
Theodore saw that money was created by the banking system, and that as the quantity of exchange business rose, so did the quantity of money rise. Now, when big business began to decline, the quantity of money began to decline. The banks had a controlling power in money, and Theodore saw this was one of the vital factors in determining what we would call now the level of activity, the level of employment, whether we've got booms or whether we've got recessions and depressions.
The chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson, believed any increase in the volume of money would debase the currency. Theodore's Reserve Bank Bill outraged the banks. They said the level of activity was for banks to determine, not government. The Conservative-dominated Senate agreed, and the bill was consigned to the limbo of a select committee.
That's how you deal with things when you don't want to deal with them. During the Depression, goods were extremely cheap. If you had a job, like if you're one of the 70% that had a job, you're doing fine. But if you didn't have a job, well, you suffered. The price deflation, the dropping of prices, means that literally more and more people are thrown out of work. Because if you think about it, right, you decrease the price of the goods that you're trying to produce as a company, means you get less money in. Where you're going to make your cuts to the people that you employ. So therefore, you end up with more and more unemployment, and the economy as a whole, more importantly, grinds to a halt as unemployment goes through the roof.
But as the level of activity continued to drop, unemployment broke through 15%. Scullin prepared to leave for a British Empire conference in London, and it was announced that Theodore would be acting Prime Minister. Four days before Theodore could bring down the 1930 budget, a Queensland Royal Commission found him guilty of corruption. In 1922, during Theodore's premiership, the Queensland government bought mines at Mungana to supply the Chillago smelters. This was part of Queensland Labor's program of state enterprise. They ran bakeries, butcher shops, cattle stations and pubs. The Royal Commission, appointed by a now Conservative Queensland government, found that Theodore had been a secret shareholder in Mungana mines. The Bank of New South Wales provided the newspapers with cheques made out to Theodore many years earlier.
Mungana is a very fine word for political reasons, if you think about it. You pay some mindless heckler to go to a meeting, and all he has to do is shout, "What about Mungana?" It's a beautiful word politically. And it was used to the last drop of blood they could get out of it.
Theodore was forced to stand down as treasurer, pending a trial. The banks were now firmly in control of the economy.
This is the first chance I've had to talk to you, and I'm coming straight to the point. What is the farmer's best friend? The bank. Quite right, but not the bank that you mean. There's one bank that never charges interest. Lead me to it, Dad. I will. The river bank.
So here you had, on July the 2nd, 1930, Scullin announced that he was going to go to England to this imperial conference. Scullin was a very sick guy. He had pleurisy, which is the inflammation of the thin membranes that surround the lungs. So he was very ill and obviously indisposed all the time. On July the 6th, 4 days later, Theodore resigned as treasurer. And then on the 14th of July, 1930, just not even 10 days after Theodore resigned as treasurer, the economic delegation arrived to Australia led by Sir Otto Niemeyer. Right? He told the state premiers that at that particular time the governments must follow the principles of sound finance, stop borrowing, reduce expenditure and balance the budgets. Niemeyer had been invited by the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, Sir Robert Gibson, to come to Australia, obviously to counter to Theodore at that particular time. Gibson insisted that Australian governments and Australian banks meet the terms of the Bank of England, because only then could it meet its overseas debts and maintain its credit rating. This is sound finance. The state premiers and acting treasurer, Joe Lyons, pledged to balance their budgets by the end of the financial year, which of course at that time was June 1931. But another big piece of the cowardice that you saw in this particular part of the story, and I don't know what else to call it, but in the absence of Theodore, in August of 1930, Scullin was preparing to leave overseas, and he was quite sick that his own daughter had to take a lot of his appointments for him, that the cabinet appointed Sir Robert Gibson, or reappointed Sir Robert Gibson as the chairman of the Commonwealth Bank, against the protests of Anstey and some other Labor members. Now this was done, they say, in order to make Scullin's mission to London easier. Pile of crap that is. That was to make sure that we could never challenge or use the Commonwealth Bank. However, Theodore, you can't keep Theodore down, because from the backbench of the Parliament, he challenged Niemeyer's prescription by writing a lot of different articles, and his prescription was to put unemployment first and foremost. Theodore was a self-educated man. He left school at the age of something like 15. So he just would avidly read. Whenever he goes to Labor Party picnics, he was just in the corner reading. And so consequently, he self-educated himself to fully understand what economics was about, and had the qualifications to challenge Niemeyer. But unfortunately, in the climate of political situation at that time, that was not all that he had to concern himself about.
When Theodore had moved to Sydney, he stepped onto the turf of the big fella of New South Wales Labor, Jack Lang.
Jack Lang regarded Theodore as a political rival. Something I could never understand. Theodore didn't criticise him. Theodore didn't want to run the New South Wales Labor Party. But Lang turned on Theodore, and I remember the organising secretary saying to the party, "These two will fight it out." I think that was Lang's idea.
In October 1930, Jack Lang regained the New South Wales premiership by rejecting the belt tightening of the other premiers.
Boy, he was a spellbinder. He had a rasping, snarly sort of a voice, and there were no amplifiers in those days. I was within, say, a couple of 100 yards of him, and he said, "I'm determined that the babies of Balmain will not suffer at the hand of blood-sucking bandits like Niemeyer from the Bank of England," that sort of thing. He was a frightening speaker. He was the sort of bloke that he snarled at everything. Yeah. The bloodsuckers of Britain, he used to say.
Private enterprise collapsed. Throw them out. onto the street unemployed. Their bosses didn't want them. They could starve, they could perish.
But by Christmas 1930, under Lyons, unemployment had increased to 20%, and there were no solutions in sight. In early 1931, the state governments realised they could not balance their budgets as they'd previously promised the Bank of England, and they were, after Nehemiah's visit, so consequently they were in bad shape. Effectively, since Theodore's resignation in May of the 1930, this Labor government under Scullin, without Scullin, who was still in England, and under Lyons's leadership, basically just drifted, incapable of making decisions. Nehemiah's solutions, called sound finance, which we heard was cutting wages, pensions and so forth, salaries, stopping borrowing and all sort of things like that. Classical economics, as it was called, wasn't being bought by the rest of the Labor caucus, but there wasn't really any solutions put forward. Now, I want to say some things about the next clip afterwards, because you could be a little bit misled by what's presented here, because it's actually quite deceptive. You're going to hear, for example, how Ted Theodore was supposed to have been persuaded by the increasingly famous John Maynard Keynes into his monetary policy. Now, when you do a lot of reading about this particular era, what you hear is that great leaders were actually Keynesian supporters, which is not true. Franklin Delano Roosevelt is reported in some biographies as saying being highly influenced by Keynes. Not true. This was an operation which I'll go through in a minute. Same thing of Ted Theodore. So watch this clip and I'll explain a bit more afterwards.
Classical economists were supply-side economics. They looked only at costs of production, getting costs down, with all that involved, as the main way to prosperity, the supply side. That is classical economics. That is economic rationalism as it has come back now.
The Great Depression was a boom time for economists. Economics was in the spotlight as never before.
We have nothing to fear.
From Cambridge, John Maynard Keynes challenged the orthodox fixation with the supply side.
It said the main thing in prosperity is effective demand for goods and services that are produced down there on the supply side. Unless you have enough effective demand, they won't function on the supply side, no matter how low they can get their costs. Because the lower they get their costs, the less effective demand there will be. Because costs become income, income becomes spent in effective demand, and if you cut your costs down very low, you'll be cutting effective demand as well. So you can't make business prosperous unless it can sell its stuff.
The first copy of Keynes's Treatise on Money to reach Australia was flown out for Ted Theodore. From the backbench, Theodore put forward a Keynesian plan for Australia's recovery. He agreed that national income had shrunk dramatically, but pointed to the impact of orthodox cost-cutting, industry paralysed, business confidence shattered, and unemployment spiralling. The free market had failed to meet people's needs. It was time for bold government intervention, he said. Attack unemployment first by stimulating the economy through controlled credit expansion.
So, if you were just an ordinary person, you'd just think, oh, John Maynard Keynes made a contribution. No. Go back and have a look at our New Citizens on the subject, right? Go back and read what we've put out on this, Defeat the British Crown plot, and then go back and read this one, and then go back and read the Republican pamphlet. And you'll get the story of this is an operation top-down from the inside heart of the British Crown. John Maynard Keynes was not just some economist that thought up, mystical economic theory. He was the head of the apostles. The apostles were the leadership, the 12 apostles, mind you, not 13 or 15, but the apostles were the leadership of a very high-level British Empire college called Trinity College, which was part of Cambridge University. Cambridge University was taken over effectively in the times of King Henry VIII under the Venetian operative Francisco Zorzi. You might know the sex story of King Henry VIII. He wanted to get a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. He hunted the world and couldn't find any priests that would do that, so they found a Venetian priest, or he found a Venetian priest, and through this Venetian priest, they came to advise him about what he could do, and in the end, he divorced Catherine of Aragon. But he not only did that, he divorced Catherine of Aragon. Therefore, he divorced the Catholic Church, and then basically took over the entire Catholic monasteries, Catholic churches, and just redistributed the wealth accordingly. Two of those Catholic monasteries that he took over, one was Cambridge and the other one was Oxford. Now, Cambridge University became the world's premier think tank. It was the elite university in Britain, and Trinity College was the elite college within Cambridge, and the Apostles were the elite within Trinity. Their members were recruited from either the very brightest of undergraduates or from the ranks of the empire's ruling families. In either case, before his recruitment, each candidate was carefully vetted and had to prove his degeneracy before admittance. Typical of such priesthoods, by the time of Bertrand Russell in the late 19th century, the Apostles avowed their adherence to what they called the higher sodomy. So, here you have John Maynard Keynes, as this article here in January 1993 from EIR refers to him as a flaming faggot, which I think he referred to himself as, and I believe he had a black book where he meticulously kept all of his sexual exploits written down. Not only was that the case, but he was also an open supporter of eugenics. He was a leading member of the British Eugenics Society, right, which into the late 1930s hosted and praised some of the same Nazi race scientists who went on to design Hitler's final solution policy and were finally condemned at Nuremberg for mass murder. He was a fanatical Malthusian, sharing thereby the same underlying philosophy which moved the Nazis to the practice of population control against the populations of Eastern Europe. In fact, Malthusianism was a central axiom of Keynes' economic theories. Okay. He also had a violent hatred against the Republican economic principles associated with Leibniz, with Alexander Hamilton and Friedrich List, upon which the rise of a free and prosperous Germany up until World War I had been based, and which Hitler's shark collaboration was intended to destroy once and for all. So this is the guy that's supposed to support the idea of fixing the economy? No. Because the intention is not that. The intention is to drive away any idea of this concept of sovereign control of credit. I mentioned before that Theodore had already introduced a bill, the Reserve Bank Bill. What was its intention? Is to use the power of government to regulate the currency. Well, Keynes's job was to use statistical monetarist methods to muddy the water up so much that people would to destroy the capability of this idea of sovereign governments actually intervene to emit credit. So that's the sort of story that we uncover and tell, and get yourself a copy and reread it. So the issue comes down to actually whether sovereign national governments have the right to emit credit for the development of sovereign nation states, or the private bankers and the City of London monetarism for the British Empire with their acolytes like John Maynard Keynes. Because you got to remember your history. The British Empire reeled under what Abraham Lincoln did after the American War of Independence, Civil War. Right? He showed the issue actually then was population increase, massive infrastructure development, right? Actually, cultural optimism. Look at the FDR with the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, right? A wholly owned corporation. The US government created the national credit actually to rescue America from the private banking system, which was finished. 24,000 banks in the United States, I think 14,000 of them were going under. 10,000 did going under before they 10,000 did end up going under before they were able to put the necessary moves into place. But see, Australia was losing, the British were losing control in the sense of Australia, because if this continued, you were going to get revolutions, because high unemployment leads to the potential for revolution. For temporarily, they'd removed Theodore from the scene, but there's no guarantee that he wasn't coming back. So the British had to promote Keynes and his statistical monetarism as a solution. Now, since Labor had won office, unemployment had increased at a rate of 1% per month. Today, a small increase here in Victoria from 5.6 to 5.8% makes headlines in Victoria. Think about it. When Scullin returned to Australia on the 6th of January 1931, he faced a country where real unrest was beginning to break out. Unemployment had broken through the 20% mark, as I mentioned before. I think, and it's important to think about what Australia would look like today if our unemployment levels were at 20%. And then ask yourself the question, is that possible? Well, what happens if we lose China as a major export partner? It's not the unthinkable. So what would we do? So Scullin appealed to the people again. I think there's a fair bit of desperation in this, and then shortly took action.
My message to the people of Australia today is this. No matter what you may read or what you may hear, I ask you to believe me that the government of Australia will do nothing to ruin Australia or run it over the precipice. I ask that you will have confidence in your government, that you will have confidence in your nation, and that you will have confidence in yourself.
Scullin did act by reinstating, on January 26th, Ted Theodore as Treasurer, without the Mangana affair being settled. The establishment had a real reason to fear Theodore, as he'd already begun proposing solutions that put the general welfare first. For example, just the day after he was reinstated, he gave an address during the Ashfield by-election, I think in New South Wales, favouring credit creation. This was his first address since being appointed as Treasurer. But now, as Treasurer, he could argue with more force that government intervention was required to increase aggregate demand, right? Spend money or give direct money into the economy so that the money could be put to work. You had to put people back to work, get people back into employment. Because, yes, Mr. Keynes, the free market had failed. Now, Jack Lang, as you can imagine, was not very impressed that these new developments had happened. And he said, with Theodore back in charge of the Commonwealth Treasury, I realised that he was still my most bitter enemy. 2 days later, on January the 28th, Joe Lyons resigned from the ministry in protest. But really, this was just an ace in the hole for the counterattack against Theodore from inside the Labor Party. A few days later, 6 days later, or 4 days later, on February the 4th, Lyons went to Melbourne to hand over his portfolio, obviously to the next member, but also to meet secretly with Staniforth Ricketson and the group of six. Staniforth Ricketson, now the later Sir Staniforth, was the chairman of directors of J.B. Ware and Son, the largest stockbroker in Australia between the war, and the underwriter of Australian government loans taken up within the country. Most of the loans in Australia at that time were floated in London, as Robbie said, being handled by the firm of Niverson, one of the 5 big financial firms of the British Empire. Ricketson was on intimate terms with the Niverson executives. The group of 6 were a powerful grouping of businessmen, journalists and others around Ricketson who hated the Labor Party of Scullin. Now, with Sir Robert Menzies present at that meeting with Lyons, they asked Lyons to leave the Labor Party to form a temporary government. And as you'll see later in this presentation, Lyons split the government and formed the UAP. But because the Commonwealth Bank under Gibson blocked all attempts to provide credit no matter what from earlier appeals from Theodore, Theodore began proposing what's called a fiduciary note issue of £18 million, which became the cornerstone of his plan that he later took to a Premier's conference called by Jack Lang in early February. Now, a fiduciary note issue means that you issue credit without backing of gold. Up until this time, all the notes say, if it's a £10 note, this note is redeemable in gold, right? So what he was proposing is we're going to use the wealth of the government to back our currency, okay? And we're going to produce £18 million of this currency as an economic stimulus, that's the wrong word these days, under Rudd, to boost purchasing power. He also said we're going to increase total tax revenue obtained from bondholders from £400,000 per annum to £5 million per annum, in other words, tax them more, decrease interest rates. The government would take control of idle gold reserves because the gold was acting like a de facto currency behind the scenes, and the government would regulate the overseas transfer of Australian private and corporate funds. In other words, control the private banking system that could play havoc in trade. Theodore stated that the $18 million credit expansion would provide jobs for 40 to 50,000 men, and that their employment and their spending power will create opportunities for the employment of another 40,000 men. Of the £18 million, £6 million would be issued for the purposes of providing relief to wheat growers. The remaining £12 million will be issued in amounts not more than £1 million per month for the purposes of providing employment in public works. Now, fiduciary note issues were not new, right? They were common in England already. As Theodore told the Parliament in his 17th of March 1931 address, and I quote, "In England a form of currency known as fiduciary currency has been in operation for many years and is now under the management of the Bank of England. Under the British Currency and Bankers Act of 1928, the Bank of England can issue notes representing £260 million in excess of the notes issued against gold." In England you can issue £260 million worth, but in Australia it's bad news to issue 18 million. Because look, the principle of this, as he told Parliament in his speech of March 1931, and if anyone wants a copy of this, I will happily print it off for you. I didn't want to print it off, it's a fairly long document. This is a 2-hour speech that is regarded by many, many people as the finest speech anyone has ever given in the Parliament of Australia. And what Theodore was trying to do, he's saying, we have a country that is wealthy, that is okay, why not issue the currency against the wealth of the nation? He said, Australia is faced with a crisis which may be described as a result of the breakdown of our monetary and economic system. That breakdown is evident when we reflect that, although our productivity capacity is almost without limit, many thousands of our citizens are either starving or on the brink of starvation. There is a vast amount of work waiting to be done in Australia, work which is necessary for the proper development of the country and would, if completed, be reproductive. But the work is not being proceeded with, although scores of thousands of our citizens are unemployed and hungering for work. The industries of our country are intact. The organisation of industry and the marketing of the products have been placed on a sound basis. Our land has not been devastated by war, drought, pestilence, flood, or any other natural evil or calamity. Our transport services are better than they have ever been. Our warehouse accommodation has never been so great. Wharfs and other facilities for the handling of goods are in as good a condition as ever, yet the country is commercially and industrially paralysed. The troubles from which we are suffering arise not from what may be termed natural causes, but from human causes, from the maladministration of the system that is operating within the country. We are where we are today because of the human faults and the complete breakdown of our monetary system. And consequently, this really freaked out the Conservatives, and their media ran overtime. Incredible hysteria campaign, right? Just remember today, every single dollar is fiduciary.
The cornerstone of Theodore's recovery plan was an £18 million fiduciary note issue, injecting credit into the economy for public works and assistance to the stricken wheat farmers. The press and the banks condemned the fiduciary note issue as a one-way ticket to inflation and warned that Australia's currency would become valueless.
People became hysterical, of course, once it was suggested that notes would be printed to finance the public works. And they thought that if you once started to inflate, if you once started to use bank notes, if you once started to use central bank credit, then everybody would be ruined by the rapid rise in prices that would follow from that. There was real hysteria.
So, but nonetheless, as Treasurer, he was able to take his plan forward to a Premier's Conference that was called by Jack Lang in February of 1931.
As 1931 dawned, it was clear that no Australian government could meet the Bank of England's terms and balance its budget by June. Theodore presented his plan at a crisis meeting with state premiers, including Jack Lang. Theodore argued that inflation could be controlled, and while cuts would have to be made, credit was the key to putting the nation to work. With the premiers poised to accept the plan, Jack Lang called for an adjournment. When the conference resumed, Lang branded Theodore a banker's man and tabled his own plan, 3 sentences long. Lang said that if interest repayments to British bondholders were suspended, Australia's standard of living could be maintained.
Now Premier Lang for us will fight, we've got to see him through. Our motto clear is Lang is right, and don't we know it too?
The Lang plan gripped the imagination of the unemployed and lowly paid workers overnight. The New South Wales and Federal Labor parties split, and Lang formed his own federal party. New South Wales, he said, would go it alone.
So give 3 cheers for Premier Lang and good old New South Wales.
The other premiers rejected Lang's plan and commissioned Theodore to negotiate with the banks for credit.
So what was the Lang plan? Ben, please. That the governments of Australia decided to pay no further interest to the British bondholders until Britain had dealt with the Australian overseas debts in the same manner as she settled her own foreign debt with America. That the interest on all government borrowings be reduced to 3%, and that immediate steps be taken by the Commonwealth Government to abandon the gold standard of currency and set up in its place a currency based on the wealth of Australia to be termed a good standard. Well, on the first point, I think the first 2 points are self-evident about what he was calling for, and there was an element of justice about the first point because, America forgave England's debt during the First World War. Yet Australia had suffered huge losses. We'd lost 60,000 men, yet the English are saying, pay those debts. And Jack Lang was saying, no, we're not going to pay the debts. We've already paid it in a sense. Right? We paid it in blood. Then you had the reduction of interest. Well, he was in agreement with Theodore with that. And then the third point, it might sound a little bit of a strange point, but actually he did have a bit of a point there because he was looking at this issue of getting away from the gold standard, which of course is what King O'Malley had talked about earlier. He said, it was my proposal that instead of setting up, he said this in 1970 I should say, it was my proposal that instead of setting up our external balance of payments in gold or sterling, we should make payment in our own currency, which would mean that if Australia owed more in London than she earned, the British creditors would have balances in Australian banks which they could use for the purchases of Australian goods. It would mean that when trade between the two countries revived, Britain would have the funds necessary to buy Australian enterprises. The goods standard meant that instead of trade balances requiring the shipment of gold bullion, all that would have to be shipped would be goods at world market prices. However, there was other differences between Lang and Theodore's plan, which was quite startling. I mean, Theodore's plan, for example, was far more considered, although quite radical for Australia at the time, whereas Lang's plan appeared to have been thrown together over the weekend. So why was Lang trying to scuttle Theodore's plan? I haven't answered that question yet myself. But I think Theodore's response to Lang sums up why the state premiers went with Theodore's plan in the end, because Theodore said, Mr. Lang could, it is true, take the first step, but how could he continue to finance his governmental arrangements thereafter? Where could he get the money to enable him to do so? If he could rid himself of the obligation to pay the Commonwealth his proportion of the interest, he would certainly have the amount to play with, or that amount to play with. But what other funds could he get? In the circumstances, would the banks provide overdrafts for New South Wales, not banked by a Commonwealth Government Treasury bill? It is clear as a pikestaff that we'll only get a practical policy by acting together. At that particular point, the state government loans to Britain were actually backed by the Commonwealth because we'd come together as a federation. So the point was, if you go ahead with this, you're not going to get any more funding. So how are you going to survive, right? But these discussions weren't taking place in a void, right? You've got to remember the social costs. There was a huge social drama unfolding in Australia at that time. In 1931, 1 million people, or 1/6 of the population, had no income. Evictions were rife and often violent. Evictees were given 30 days to move out. On the last day, they were literally physically thrown out by the local police. Right? We don't see much of that, if any of that, happening today. And it was only done, fortunately, during daylight hours. But by 1933, as nothing had changed, the census showed that 33,000 people were on the road in the middle of the winter, wandering around. A further 400,000 were sheltering under calico, canvas, hessian, bark and other makeshift materials. 1 in 16 people were sleeping under the stars.
The Senate and the banks paid no heed to the clamour in the cities. The Conservative Senate rejected Theodore's Fiduciary Notes Bill, and the Commonwealth and private banks refused to provide credit. Sir Robert Gibson delivered an ultimatum to the state and federal governments. Make the cuts to salaries, wages and pensions, or the Commonwealth Bank would stop the money supply. With the battle of the plans at a stalemate, professional economists entered the field of national policy for the first time.
I was asked by the Commonwealth Bank to come along as an economist. As their first economist, they didn't have one before that.
Leslie Melville joined a team of academic economists commissioned by the state premiers to present a plan to meet the financial crisis at a special premiers conference in June 1931.
The governments of the Commonwealth and of the states have been gathered together during the last 3 weeks to evolve a plan to meet the serious financial position confronting Australia. That plan has now been worked out.
We sat in considerable doubt as to what would happen when this plan was taken to Theodore, and we were incredibly pleased and perhaps astounded when Sheehan brought back the word that he was going to accept it.
Nearly everyone is affected in some way or other in the measures adopted under the Premiers' Conference Rehabilitation Plan. Some are affected by suffering a reduction in interest or in other income, some by reduction in wages or pensions or salaries, some by increased taxation. Not anybody escapes from the general sacrifice.
The Premier's plan cut wages and salaries by 20%. Taxes increased, and old age pensions dropped 12.5%. The only concession won by Theodore was a 22.5% cut in interest paid to Australian bondholders.
The holders of the bonds and government securities generally, by making their contribution, will be helping Australia in this hour of trial, and will be helping their fellow citizens, many of whom are suffering great hardship and distress.
Returns to British bondholders were not cut. Theodore had accepted the poison chalice. As Treasurer, he was responsible for the greatest reduction in expenditure in Australia's history.
Gibson had said that the Commonwealth Bank would not honour his cheques beyond a certain point, and that that would have brought him to the position where he wouldn't have had finance to pay public servants. And he had nowhere to go. He really had to accept the Premier's plan.
The battle of the plans was over and Theodore had lost. The Premier's plan was a victory for orthodox economists and banks and had no trouble passing through the Senate. The cuts reduced the level of activity in the economy even further, causing more bankruptcies and redundancies. Unemployment reached 27%.
Therein lies the fiduciary note issue, scuttled by the upper house that we were warned about early in the piece. The Premier's plan, right, Great Conversion Loan. This was adopted by June 1931, after the Senate had killed off the fiduciary note issue plan of Theodore. He had nowhere to go, as you heard. The Commonwealth Bank threatened not to pay the bills. Where do you go with that? Nowhere. So the Premiers had to agree to this. Theodore agreed to it because he had nowhere else to go. Great Conversion Loan to secure reductions of 22.5% of internal interest burden to bondholders, from bondholders. Reduction of by 20% against 1929 to 1939 levels, 1930 levels of all adjustable government expenditure, including wages, salaries, material social services, pensions. This was a real sticking point for the Labor Party because a lot of people in the Labor Party did not want pensions to be cut, but they had to wear that. There was more taxation, as you see, reduction of interest rates on deposits so that the banks didn't have to pay out, and state parliaments could give relief in respect of private mortgages. So the state government, as you heard, the Scullin government and the state governments all brought in professional economists who took their cue actually from John Maynard Keynes. Just like in other fields, for example, in climate change today, all these scientists that are produced by the British Empire to push out the Empire's own warnings, it's the same thing, whether it be climate change or global warming or whatever. Force it down the throats of all the institutions, and it all comes out. When you trace it back, it all comes out to these institutions like the Apostles, Trinity and Cambridge. But Joe Lyons, the banker's boy, now swooped.
Joe Lyons was persuaded by a group of Melbourne businessmen to desert Labor and lead the Nationalists under a new name, the United Australia Party. 5 former Labor members joined him. The balance of power lay with the Lang faction. In November, the 5 Lang followers accused Theodore of pork barrelling in his Balmain electorate and voted with the opposition to bring the government down.
Now this election has come very suddenly upon everyone. I can give you no better advice than to tune in with Britain. Trust the United Australia Party as the British people trusted the United British Party. Do as Britain did. The mad financial schemes and irresponsible actions of Mr. Lang smashed the great savings bank of New South Wales. I ask you, do you propose to give to Mr. Theodore, with his equally mad financial schemes, an opportunity to smash the whole banking system in Australia?
The only good news for Ted Theodore in 1931 was his acquittal in the long-delayed Mungana trial in Brisbane. 6,000 people cheered as he left the court, but his reputation was smeared forever.
Is it any accident that Clive Palmer is trying to call his party the United Australia Party? I mean, come on. Anyway, continue.
In the landslide that annihilated the Scullin government, Ted Theodore lost his seat to a Lang candidate. It was the end of his political career. Lang's party won only 3 seats. Lyons, the new Prime Minister, made it illegal for New South Wales to default on overseas loans. 2 months after opening the Sydney Harbour Bridge, Lang was sacked by the New South Wales Governor for defying the new federal law. He was never Premier again, but Labor remained split for a decade. Joe Lyons was to be Prime Minister throughout the 1930s. His government stuck to the Premier's plan, trusting in market forces to pull Australia out of depression. The predicted rise in investor confidence failed to eventuate. By 1933, 1 in every 3 Australian workers was out of a job.
Between 1929 and 1938, government revenue and expenses completely stagnated. In 1929, expenditure was £78 million. By the pre-war year of 1938, it was only £81 million. So over that entire period, from 29 to 38, expenditure only increased by £3 million. However, from those next few years on, from 1938 to 1945, those years proved that everything that Ted Theodore had proposed was not only correct, but completely doable. The Depression was completely unnecessary, but it was not conscious economic choices towards the general welfare of the population that made the change, but as Robbie emphasised, it was war.
We didn't rely on market economics in order to pay for the war.
The full cabinet today directed the War Cabinet to gazette the necessary regulations for the complete mobilisation of all the resources, money, machinery, buildings, plants, whatever it may be.
In 1941, John Curtin's Labor government took control of the Australian economy. Everything was directed to the war effort. Taxation, forced savings, internal and external borrowing, rationing, price controls to stop inflation, and credit from the Commonwealth Bank.
Here was a job for bushman, carrier, wharfie, carpenter, welder, painter, engineer and clerk. A job for the mines, the mills, and the foundries. And everything had to be quick.
With the outbreak of war, an endless stream of money poured into public works, creating a job for every man and woman able to work. Unemployment disappeared in Australia. The Great Depression was over.
Not only was full employment established almost overnight under wartime conditions, but the Commonwealth Bank, under the control of our 2 greatest wartime prime ministers, at the time Chifley was Treasurer, was brought under control, was forced to act. And as Robbie said, wartime conditions change everything. And this is what should have been done during the Depression's years. When war first broke out to fight Britain's war, the government under Menzies suddenly found enough funds to increase expenditure by 300%, from £81 million to £246 million in 1941. And then as you see, go back one please, Ben. As you see here, from 1941, when the nation was at its greatest peril from the threat of Japanese invasion, and I might add we were abandoned by Britain at that particular point, and John Curtin had to look to America for help. And in that collaboration, it was able to find £677 million, or an 800% increase from the Depression levels. So what I've gone through today, John Curtin and Ben Chifley both knew this was possible to take place, and they actually mobilised with the support of General MacArthur, Franklin Roosevelt and others in order to bring about strong government intervention into the economy, to provide the necessary credit to develop and grow the economy as was prescribed by Ted Theodore back in 1929 and 1930. So the only thing that was different was the bastardry of the British Empire. Thank you very much.